Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy for your consumption, but more importantly so that you can go off into the world around us and face all the folks who have been getting the Facebook posts and the Internet Research Agency feeds about pipelines and deadlines and every other bit of a story, and go out with it with some backing on things that you can counter some of this with and maybe even engage in some winning discussion. First up this week, I know many of the conservative, especially grassroots conservatives, feel like, boy, if only the Republicans in Congress were as smart as some of the Democrats. For example, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, aside from its name, the fact that it was really just an add-on provision in a bill that was completely unrelated to patient protection or affordable care. How'd that happen? How'd that get there? What do you mean it's a straight up and down simple majority? How'd they do that? Well, we have some senators that have advised the president of something like that, and to take us inside of it is the president of American Commitment. He is Phil Kerpen. Phil has been at this probably long enough to have heard that same complaint about how much smarter the Democrats in the House and Senate are than Republicans, and is very pleased to bring us stories of finally some Republicans who have figured out how to do it. Phil, good morning and welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing great. How are you?
Excellent, and very happy to read about this. Now, this all begins with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we were told that this chicken in the bull in the China shop president was going to wreck, and we're going to have massive problems with it. Yet the first thing that happened is Mexico and Canada are sitting down at the table with the president, which is a great opportunity. But you say it's one that could go even further, couldn't it?
Yeah, they're definitely pretty advanced in negotiations, and they could come to an agreement on a new NAFTA, really any day now. But I think that sort of the ambition, the scope of what they're trying to accomplish is much narrower than it could be. When you consider that the only piece of legislation of any significance that might pass this year in this current Congress is the new NAFTA agreement, because it's the only one that will not require a 60-vote vote. It will be submitted under fast-track trade promotion authority, protected from filibuster. It will be a 50-vote vote. They did not do a budget this year, so they will not have a reconciliation bill. That was the process they used for the tax cuts last year, and so this is it. This is going to be the only train leaving the station, the only 50-vote vote in the Senate for this current Congress. And if you believe the prognosticators that the House may be in Democratic hands next year, this could be the last piece of legislation of any significance in this current presidential term. And so it's really critical that whatever big things they still hope to accomplish legislatively this year get included in the NAFTA negotiations, because otherwise they're going to die at the hands of a Democratic filibuster. And so for that reason, a few senators, led by Ted Cruz, but he also had Steve Daines and Cory Gardner sign on to this, have urged the president to add an additional chapter to the new NAFTA agreement that they call the competitiveness chapter. And it would be designed to sort of enshrine permanently the permitting and regulatory reforms that we've already seen under the Trump administration. So the next Democrat as president, can't just come back in and put all the Obama regulations in at the snap of his fingers. They will have some stability in the regulatory environment, which will encourage more investment in productivity, resource extraction, and manufacturing. And that's, of course, highly relevant to NAFTA, because if you want to be a more effective competitor in international trade, you've got to have a stable, permanent, good regulatory environment so that you'll have investment long-term and you'll be competitive and do better in the trade relationships as well. And so I think there's a very good argument that what they're trying to do is directly relevant to the objectives of NAFTA, but perhaps even more significantly, this is really the only way to make these reforms permanent and get them through the Senate without being subject to a Democratic filibuster. And so we're strongly supporting this strategy. At the moment, at least, it looks like the administration is not going to pursue it, which I think would be a huge missed opportunity. But I know Senator Cruz is pushing very hard to get a meeting directly with the president to try to sell him on it. And I hope that'll happen while there's still time to tack this on to the new NAFTA.
I know there are many people listening right now saying, hold it, they're close to a renegotiation. And this has sort of been the hallmark of the last year and a half, Phil, is, when the news coverage is about lawyers and early morning raids and porn stars and Twitter feeds, all this governing has been going on without really all that much news scrutiny at all in this. And, all of a sudden war is over in North Korea and South Korea, and they're sitting down and having peace accords, and NAFTA is almost renegotiated, and all these things the president was laughed at for announcing on the campaign trail seem to be coming true. But moreover than that, this should be a home run for the president, because this is that second shoe in any trade deal. You have to make sure that you're going to come up with something that's a win for everybody. But I look at some of the stuff that Cruz, Gardner, and Daines have talked about, and this is all that second part of any trade deal, to make sure that you have a workforce and a regulatory environment that can compete with perhaps a more state-managed economy in Canada or Mexico or anywhere else in the world, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mentioned permitting and regulatory. They're also, in their draft chapter, have a lot of stuff on workforce development, making sure that our job training programs and so forth actually match the demands that are out there in the work. We've got a big mismatch problem now, and they've got some infrastructure provisions as well, which are critical to the president's agenda. And, I don't see how else he gets that done, because there's this theory that some of this stuff could be bipartisan, so Democrats will get on board and that kind of. I don't see it happening. I think the way the partisan environment is poisonous, Democrats are not going to want the president to get any of his priorities, and so I think they really need to think about how can we get these things done on a partisan basis with a 50-vote vote, and Senator Cruz has laid out the path in using the NAFTA agreement to do that. And you're right that it's really a critical part of being successful in our trade relationships as well. This is not just an instance of attaching unrelated matter for a procedural trick to get around the filibuster, though I would point out, the Democrats have no compunctions at all about doing just that. When they write trade agreements, they load them up with all kinds of labor and environmental rules to get things in terms of increasing regulation that they couldn't get any other way. This is just the opposite of that, getting things through in terms of deregulation, but it really is directly relevant to the objective of the fast-track law and of the NAFTA negotiations itself, because it's not enough just to knock down barriers to trade in other countries. You've got to knock down the barriers to your own country to being competitive long term, and particularly in areas like resource extraction and manufacturing. It would be a big problem if everything that this administration has done, all the progress that they've made, can just be instantly reversed at the pleasure of the next president, because it could be a liberal Democrat who wants all the regulations back in. And so we really do need to codify and sort of cement in place a lot of these reforms if we want to have a long-term be more competitive internationally.
Phil Kerpen is the president of American Commitment. We're talking about the president, an add-on that Senator Cruz and Senator Gardner and Senator Daines are proposing to the new NAFTA that is in the process of being renegotiated. You had mentioned resource restriction as part of this. What about senators like Joe Manchin in North Carolina? We just saw him break ranks and vote with Republicans on some appointments. And so I think the case could be made that especially senators like that, both from a state that the president did very well in, Claire McCaskill being another one, you could get to them and say, listen, this benefits your state, whether it's a party win or not. Do you want to just go down with the ship, or are you going to do what's right, what you swore to do when you took this office?
Yeah, Manchin's a very interesting case. Manchin, I think you said North Carolina. He's from West Virginia.
Oh, did I say no? I'm sorry. It was a mistake.
Very interesting case there, because that state was absolutely crushed by Obama regulations, particularly anti-coal regulations from the EPA and from several other federal regulators as well. And the idea that he would vote no on a package like this, which includes a bill called the REINS Act that would require congressional approval votes for major regulations. The idea that he would vote no on that would basically be telling his constituents, I have no problem at all if the next Democratic president can, snap his fingers and the war on coal is back in place and our state is crushed the same way it was under Obama. I don't see that as politically tenable for him in his state. Mm-hmm. And so I think that he would almost certainly have to vote for the agreement if it included this chapter. Other Democrats less so, for a variety of reasons. They could find excuses, rely on favorable media coverage, and so forth. But I think it speaks to sort of a legislative calculation that I think is important, because the reason that the administration, in particular U.S. Trade Rep Robert Lighthizer, who's leading the negotiations, the reason they've been resistant to adding this chapter is they really feel a time crunch to get negotiations completed prior to the Mexican presidential election, which I believe is July 1st, because one of the candidates is basically a hardcore socialist, and if he wins, they just don't see how they're going to get any agreement of any kind. So they feel they're racing against the clock, and they don't want to expand the agreement and make it more ambitious, because they don't want to put anything else on the table and risk not getting it done in time. But I think that if they don't add this chapter, if they keep their ambitions narrow, they're in great danger of failing to pass whatever they negotiate through Congress, because there's not going to be great Republican enthusiasm for some of the things they're trying to do. In particular, they're talking about eliminating investor-state dispute settlement tribunals, which is something the oil industry is against, and they can pull a lot of Republican support off if the agreement does that. And I think that Democrats are just not going to want to give the president a win of any kind. So if the White House is counting on the fact that they're going to get a number of Democrats to vote for it to get it through, I think that's a very questionable assumption. But if they add the Cruz chapter, if they add the competitiveness chapter, now you're talking about major long-term priorities of Republicans and conservatives in terms of regulatory reform, permitting reform, some of the other things we've been talking about. And I think that if they did that, they'd get every single Republican, and they might get a handful of Democrats, people like Manchin, who are just not in a position to oppose those sorts of fundamental reforms. And so I actually think that this could be one of those situations where being more ambitious actually makes it more likely to pass through Congress than being less ambitious.
Now, certainly not trying to pretend to produce Libertad y Prosperidad radio, although if anyone on any of the radio stations that begin with the letter X would like to carry the program, we can make a Spanish language translation. You mentioned the Spanish president's election, Phil. Is this something where are we concerned that the current administration might drag its heels lest this look like they caved to the American oligarch, and is that an issue in the NAFTA negotiations, or is the president looking at this as something, if I could say I did this, maybe this will help me get reelected?
Well, look, I think all the countries that are sitting I think all three countries have, a lot of political considerations going into this, as you would expect, and I think both of those things are true. I think that there's the political concern on the Mexican side. If they get a deal that doesn't look favorable to them, that's pretty bad for the current administration politically, the optics of that. On our side, I think the president really needs to get this done. It's something he promised to do. It's pretty central in the campaign trail. But, I think that's all the more reason to get it done and make it the biggest thing possible by putting as much in there as you can and really making it a win that people can understand and not just sort of a box-checking exercise. And so I think both of those things are true, but I think, sort of the practical urgency on the American side is less about the impact of the agreement on the Mexican election and more about the possibility that after that election, the whole thing could fall apart depending on what the outcome of the election is.
Phil, let me ask you this. How plug and play is this proviso? Is this ready to go? Just staple it on and say, oh, here's addendum C. Does it need to pass Canadian and Mexican eyes, or is it purely internal as it came to this treaty? Talk about that side of it, because I can hear my friends in white suits, white shirts and red ties and blue blazers saying, oh, it's too complicated to add at this late notice. We could never draft up something for scoring or blah, 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 all the stuff that the swamp loves to say as an excuse when they don't do something.
Well, the Cruz language, that they've got a full draft chapter of this competitiveness chapter, and it's fully developed. It's written in trade language. It's got all of its substantive provisions come either from existing executive orders or from existing legislation, most of which has already passed the House but been blocked in the Senate. And so they've got this very well developed. If the administration decided to adopt the strategy, they would have a fully developed draft to start from. That said, I'm sure they would want to make changes to it because their priorities aren't necessarily exactly what Senator Cruz's priorities are. But they would have a very, very good starting point to get it done quickly. And in terms of the other parties agreeing to it, the language is designed in a way where it would be, if the other parties want to adopt the same reforms, that would be fine, and that would be great, and it would probably help the whole region if it's more economically competitive globally. But if they don't wish to, they could use party-specific annexes to note their exceptions, and that would in no way prevent us from accepting the provisions for ourselves. And so it's designed so that we would be able to adopt the language for ourselves, whether they adopt it or not in Mexico and Canada. And so it should not stall the negotiations from that standpoint.
Now watch me develop this punchline here for Phil. So Phil, I imagine a pro-business senator like Mark Warner is on board with something like this. No, that was where I was expecting. I knew, Phil. I knew there was a laugh coming in there somewhere. But certainly a case like this, politically, Phil, is something that, with a Senate race here in Virginia, should this be brought up as a campaign issue with no matter who the candidate is that will run against Tim Kaine this year? Is what his support might be for this?
I've always thought so. I mean, I've always thought that the total Democratic opposition to the idea of what I consider one of the most important things in this chapter, which is a bill I mentioned called the REINS Act that would say any new costly regulation has got to go up to Congress for approval first before it can be implemented. I've always thought the fact that Democrats are universally opposed to that should be a big political problem for them because they run for election and re-election to Congress and to the Senate, and they basically, by opposing that reform, they're saying, we want to be in the Congress, but we don't want the Congress to make the major economic policies for the country. We want the EPA and the IRS and HHS and FDA and DOL and DOT and so forth to make all the real economic policy decisions for the country without even having to send them up to us to vote on. Now, I don't understand why voters would be okay with that and are okay with that and don't demand better from our elected legislators than these broad, vague laws where they claim credit for their good intentions and then all the details are worked out by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. But, when it comes down to it, Democrats like that system. That works for them. And, I think that until voters say it doesn't work for them, it'll probably keep being that way.
It's funny you say it that way, and it reminds me that they do that from the lowest, I guess the most local level on up. To me, it's not the lowest level, but you watch all the local legislators that have planning commissions and zoning review boards and boards of architectural review and citizen review tribunals, and most of these are completely voluntary positions, but they have to give approval to a project before it goes to the legislator, whether it be a city councilor or a supervisor. And then they can just say, I'm sorry, the planning commissioner said no. And it's like political cover for these guys more than it is anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, but at least at the local level, when you hear them say, we're rejecting it based on the conclusions of whatever board or what have you. At least they're saying they're rejecting it. The way it's been working in Congress is, they passed, they passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And that's it. They don't come back to those. It just
they don't have to answer for it.
A world unto itself with lawyers and judges and environmental groups, and it's been sort of, self-propelling for 40 years.
Who could be against clean air? Phil Kerpen is president of American Commitment. I want to ask you for something, and you may rebuke or demur on this, but if Ted Cruz and along with Cory Gardner, Steve Daines, maybe even a Joe Manchin or something, was successful in having the administration add this on, or say Trump. President Trump said to Ted Cruz, and they have a rose garden ceremony with all of them. He stands next to Ted, and they're like, this is great. This is what we need to be doing. This is making America great, whatever rhetoric they use. What does this do to the Republican Party, which still, I think, is in this Ted Cruz versus Donald Trump mystery land where there are all the never Trumpers are still with their Ted Cruz pins somewhere in their house, and they're kind of hunkered down, saying, I can't take it, this guy. And it's almost like we have three parties: the Ted Cruz Republicans, the Donald Trump Republicans, the Donald Trump Democrats, and the Hillary Democrats. Would this go a long way towards healing that Republican schism if Ted Cruz was able to get this added to the NAFTA deal?
Well, I would sure hope so. I don't know. Some of our factions seem somewhat irrational at the moment, and so I don't want to overstate the case. But look, this is an administration that has remarkable accomplishments in a relatively short period of time on deregulation. Really remarkable. If you look kind of agency by agency what they've done, they've almost reversed 8 years of Obama in a year and a half, or in the process of, if you kind of look at all the major, most outrageous regulations. And that's a pretty incredible accomplishment. I think that one of the reasons that the administration, the president, doesn't necessarily get as much credit for that as he otherwise would is I think there's an assumption among a lot of conservatives that it's not going to last. That, okay, great, you can do stuff in the executive branch, but, in the next administration will reverse it again. That's not a permanent achievement. Well, that changes quite a lot if he's able to lock it all in by adding this competitiveness chapter to NAFTA and getting that passed through Congress, signing it into law. Then you would have an enduring achievement. You would lock in as a permanent matter everything that's been accomplished in terms of deregulatory action, and that would be a major accomplishment. I mean, this is like that would be the culmination of a multi-decade fight, of a very long-term fight for conservatives, something we've not been able to get a handle on. And so if that happened, it would be pretty hard to deny the significance of the accomplishment. And I think that even the most anti-Trump conservatives would have to recognize it as, a major accomplishment of this presidency. And so, I would hope so, that it would bring those factions together. But who knows? I mean, some people seem impervious to reality at the moment.
This is true. Phil, you and I have been visiting with one another since the very early days of the Taxed Enough Already programs. Is this really what all of that was building up to, is an era where we're losing 20 regulations for every new one that gets in, even though the modest proposal was for much less than that, where tax reform has gone through, where Americans are keeping more money, American businesses have more money to invest. Is this, you look back on those early days of the Taxed Enough Already campaigns, is this really what this was building up to?
Yeah, I think the substantive policy achievements have been all the things that we've been trying to get for the last decade, sort of going back to those original Tea Parties. And I don't think any one of us would have predicted it would come with a president who's sort of a bombastic reality TV star who's firing off, crazy tweets all the time or any of the rest of it. But I think that you got to kind of take it all as a package deal. And if you look at it in that way and you kind of, what's the bottom line, what's actually happened on policy, sort of area by area, it's really been positive, and it's been a lot of the things on that list that we've been trying to accomplish for a long time. The one major exception, and it's major, is on government spending, which has gone up dramatically. And of course, one of the major Tea Party impulses was to go the other way, to cut government spending. And so on spending, we haven't seen it, but on taxes and on regulation, very much, I think, what we've been pushing for a long time.
Phil, it's been great catching up again. It's AmericanCommitment.org, AmericanCommitment.org. Find them there. Great piece there as well. We'll put it up on our social media regarding this NAFTA chapter that Senator Cruz, Gardner, and Daines have put forth there. Thank you so much for catching us up, and have a wonderful weekend.
All right, have a good one.
Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine from the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Perhaps no story has at the same time been on everyone's mind and nobody's TV screen as much as the Alfie Evans case. And sadly, very little ink has been given to it either. And one column, I think, appropriately pointed out that the British government, the National Health Services, wasn't concerned. Everyone was running around. The few people that we're talking about were saying, how could the National Health Services make a decision like this about this young baby's life? And the one columnist said they weren't making the decision based on the baby's life. They were making the decision on the spreadsheet, the return on investment. Do we help this child live, and will he be a tax-paying citizen of the crown after that? And that is what socialized medicine looks like. To help us get into all this is Monica Burke, and Monica is part of the Heritage Foundation staff there, and an expert on the National Health Services and what happens when the government gets into all of these parts of our lives under whether it be the truism of best intentions or not. Monica, thanks for taking some time out with us on this very, very difficult story, and very difficult for anyone in our position to not sound like we're saying, see, we told you so, because of the tragedy of the loss of a baby that was completely unnecessary. How are you doing this weekend?
I'm doing very well, and thank you so much for having me.
So talk a little bit about the real reality that we see played out. And this isn't the first time within the last year that the National Health Service, that which the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher herself said was her greatest disappointment, that in all the things she was able to privatize, the National Health Services was the one she couldn't get done. We're seeing that this is what happens when the gray bureaucracy comes in where the heart should be, and where a parent's ability to take care of their kids should be allowed.
That is exactly correct. And unfortunately, Alfie's case is not the first time that we've seen the UK government place itself in between the sacred space between a patient and their doctor, and also between the parents and their doctors, to make decisions for their children. Your listeners might recall the case of Charlie Gard back in 2017, a very similar situation where it was ultimately the decision of a UK judge that essentially meant that Charlie's parents were not able to pursue additional care. And Alfie is now, unfortunately, another example down on the books. I'll give your listeners a little bit of Alfie's story. He was just under 2 years old when he passed away. He was hospitalized at age 1 after suffering seizures. And the doctors suspected a degenerative neurological condition, but they never confirmed a diagnosis. He was in a semi-vegetative state, and he needed a ventilator in order to breathe. And the hospital staff at his hospital, Alder Hey Children's Hospital, began to disagree with Alfie's parents about his treatment. His parents wanted to pursue additional care to continue to keep him on life support. And so what happens, given the UK system, is that the dispute was then brought to the UK courts, who ultimately decided that it was in Alfie's quote-unquote best interest to remove his ventilation. And this marked the beginning of a long and dramatic legal battle. Alfie's parents, Tom and Kate, they took every single recourse available to them. They went to the UK court several times. They appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. And this became a topic of international interest. The Italian government actually granted Alfie citizenship, and the Pope implored that the UK allow Alfie's parents to take him to Italy to pursue additional treatment and pursue a diagnosis. And ultimately, the UK would not budge. The courts repeatedly told them that not only was Alfie's life support to be removed, but he was not allowed to leave the country to pursue other kinds of care. And so on April 25th, Alfie's ventilator was removed, and he defied doctors' expectations.
Amen.
He continued to live for another 3 whole days. At first, they were denying him food and water. After a very long time, finally, they were administered him just his basic needs. And so Alfie died on the 28th. His father desperately tried to resuscitate him for 10 minutes, ultimately to no avail. And this story, this horrible story, just reminds us why the government does not get to play doctor and they don't get to play God. And this sets a dangerous precedent in the UK that hopefully won't find its way to the U.S.
You can read Monica Burke's stuff at thedailysignal.com as well. And, of course, that's the newspaper put together by the Heritage Foundation. And she works with the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society there. Monica, also part of the story, I mean, the Pope himself and of course there's a long history between the Church of England and the Pope, I understand, but the Pope himself had said his helicopter was at the disposal of Alfie's family to bring Alfie to Italy. What was the legal precedent that would allow Britain to deny him the ability to travel to Italy? I mean, what was their standing in that restriction? That was amazing to me, and the most heartbreaking jackboot part of this story is here's a free citizen, you'd like to say a free citizen able to travel without encumbrances, and they're like, no, we won't let you go. That was a stunning part to me, and if I'm not mistaken, the same thing happened with the Gard family, or Charlie Gard, that he couldn't travel to the United States for medical treatment.
Well, it's extremely troubling that the government presumes to step into the place of parents and determine what is best for an individual patient, and would go so far as to prevent their parents from even seeking a second opinion elsewhere. And I think it's extremely troubling just the number of times that the courts reiterated that it was supposedly in Alfie's best interest that they pursue this treatment plan that the court had determined itself. The court is not qualified to make medical decisions. The court is qualified to make legal decisions.
Sure.
They don't have that kind of training. They don't have that kind of background. And so the presumption of the UK courts here is absolutely astounding.
But why? And I get the cold callousness of the bean counter saying, well, this kid is always going to be a ward of the state. And I guess that is the real lesson here about socialized single-payer government health care. Bernie Sanders, are you listening? Is that eventually the government has to make that decision. Does the medical treatment we're going to pay for here wind up penciling out in the end? Will this person grow up into a tax-paying citizen that will earn back all the money we spend on his medical treatment? That is a horrible place to put anyone. We just watched Barbara Bush say to her family, and there's a family who has resources. She said, "Listen, don't do any more resuscitation on me. Please let me just be out of pain if I need to be, but let me go in peace." And that's a decision an individual gets to make. A government is just doing it like an exchequer.
Exactly. That should be the prerogative of the patient, and when the patient is unable to make those decisions, their parents or their next of kin. And I think that you hit the nail right on the head, which is this is one of the problems baked into socialist healthcare, which is that the state is almost inevitably going to presume to step into the place of doctors, to step into the place of parents and patients. And Alfie's father actually picked up on this trend, especially in view of Charlie Gard's case. And when he wrote the Archbishop of Liverpool begging him to get the Pope to intervene, to get the backing of the church in Alfie's situation, he wrote to the Archbishop that Alfie's case might set a further precedent like Charlie Gard's in order to prevent parents from taking care of their sick children, considered a burden by the state because they are ill and therefore useless, unproductive, and expensive. And this is exactly what's so dangerous about letting the state try and step into the place of parents, patients, and physicians, is that the state can make cold, hard calculus in a place where they are absolutely not qualified to be.
It also opens up in the legal world. I understand precedent in a courtroom proceeding, but I think judges and jurists tend to use it as an easy way out of actually having to make a decision on individual court case merits. But as a societal issue, precedent also opens up the door. Then where does this end? The mission creep of a national health services can start taking children from parents if they decide there's a health risk. They can start assisted suicide. Where does this end? I mean, you can gameplay this out into a million horrible places that even George Orwell wouldn't have written into a book.
Exactly. When this kind of incident becomes normalized, it becomes custom, and custom effectively gets treated like policy. And when the government gets to be the arbiter of life and death and gets to replace physicians, parents, and patients as decision makers in their own health care, it is very likely that those who are sick, those who are elderly, those who are disabled will ultimately be done away with as unnecessary expenditures. And so it's difficult to say where this will end. We have hope that the best parts of English culture would stop the UK from going down some of those slippery slopes and darker paths. But there's no natural limit to what they can do when that's the rationale behind how these medical decisions are made that might makes right.
Monica Burke with the Heritage Foundation and the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society, and both are important parts and things sadly lacking in today. Monica, thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Let me go into the backlash, and of course, certainly a lot of this couldn't have been timed this way, but the British papers were full at the same time of Alfie's story, with the royals welcoming the spare to the spare heir of William and Catherine. That was a real social black eye for the Crown in England and the British government for this. Is there reforms based on some of the very, very angry rhetoric that I've seen thrown around in the after? Certainly, the visual oddity of everyone celebrating this royal baby while one of their subjects is dying in a hospital somewhere, gagging and clinging to life. Can that bad optic be turned into good reform?
That's an excellent question. I think you're absolutely right that the optics could not have possibly been worse. And it's tragic. It's wonderful that the people of the United Kingdom were celebrating William and Kate welcoming their third child. That's exactly the culture of life that we hope that everyone might embrace. Mm-hmm. But the Alfie Evans case just goes to show how all-encompassing that culture of life has to be, how it has to be willing to support those who might not have the ideal quality of life, but whose lives are still inherently worth living because they have dignity. As for initiatives in the UK, there has been discussion of passing a law called Alfie's Law to prevent a case like Alfie's from ever happening again. I'm less familiar with UK politics and how that would fit within their broader legal system. However, I will say that it is necessary for policymakers to step in and take measures to make sure that children like Alfie or Charlie Gard cannot be victimized by the socialized healthcare system.
So bring us to this side of the pond. Now, we have a lot of things that still trace back to British common law. So much of our society is based on this, and we hear so many folks talking glowingly about the socialized medicine single-payer system, and we hear it as a campaign rhetoric coming up in the midterms. Talk about how close are we to where Britain is, and how much of a precipice we're facing over this.
That's an excellent question. It's difficult to say exactly, put a timeline on when we might find ourselves in a similar situation as Alfie's. I will note that the Daily Signal, the news organization attached to the Heritage Foundation, reached out to Bernie Sanders and 15 other senators just yesterday, asking them to comment upon Alfie's case. These senators have supported Medicare for All, and none of them responded. And I think that just goes to show that in many ways, I don't think that the United States has seriously considered the pitfalls of single-payer health care. And it's something that we absolutely need to anticipate, that we need to address on a policy level, but we also need to address on a cultural level. And it's important that Alfie's case is not forgotten, that it continues to have as high a profile as possible, because Alfie's case is extremely compelling and just goes to show what we need to be sensitive to when making healthcare policy, that at the end of the day, people are the ones involved, that this affects individual lives and even children's lives.
As an expert in civil society as well, Monica, it's certainly interesting here in this country if a parent, for religious reasons, says we don't want medical care for this, and there are religious beliefs that keep people from seeking modern medical treatment. We do sort of, bear that hypocritical. We'll go after that and say, this is horrible. They're not seeing it. But if it's the government doing it, we seem to be fine with that. Is this a breakdown of our ability to even think critically about these issues, and whose right is it anyway? And shouldn't it be the individual's right to seek the health care they want, whether it be alternative medicines or alternative treatments? We do seem to have a lot of these vestiges that say, oh, no, you can't go for that alternative cancer treatment. You can't do that because the government has a prohibition on it. And we do have a lot of the toolkit already out there for this.
Ultimately, we have to go back to first principles. And one of those first principles is that, except in cases perhaps of abuse or extenuating circumstances, parents are first and foremost the caretakers of their children and are in the best position to make decisions for their kids because they have their best interests at heart.
Amen.
And in the United States, we've had a rich history of tolerance for different religious beliefs, different moral beliefs. We've allowed for a diversity of opinion. We've been able to make those distinctions between when it's a parent's prerogative what treatment to pursue versus there being a compelling interest for the state to get involved and to perhaps put that child into foster care or social services or to look for another legal guardian. That's dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But ultimately, I think Alfie's case reminds us, going back to first principles, who gets to make decisions for children. And first and foremost, that should always be the parents.
Dave Bratt just put a bill out from the 7th District here in Virginia that would expand the ability of a citizen to keep and save money in a health savings account. Why, even Terry McAuliffe signed Delegate Steve Landis's bill in Virginia that would allow for direct primary care associations like Atlas Medical. And there are options that are still there, and we need to be finding those and promoting those. And perhaps if we gave as much airtime to those as Bernie Sanders gets for socialized single-payer medicine, we might move somewhere. Is that a fair thing to say? And what can we be doing?
Precisely. So I'm actually not one of the experts on our team on healthcare, but I will say that socialism is definitely not the option, and that we need to always put patients first in healthcare and make sure that patients are in the driver's seat of their healthcare, able to make their own decisions about what's best for them, or in Alfie's case, that their parents are able to make the decisions that are best for them and their family.
So I appreciate your taking us into this story, and your milieu is really civil society, and when we look to the gray edifice of government for our answers, wherever they are, I think that implies that we've lost the ability to. Have we ceded the ability to be civil with each other? And instances like we saw here in Virginia last August wind up being the result of it, as we've dehumanized ourselves in this zeal for the gray edifice to make these choices, whether it be for our health care payments or our car insurance or our rent payments and those sorts of things. We've dehumanized ourselves so much. We're more interconnected than ever, but less humane to each other.
That is definitely a concern. We've definitely seen a decrease in what a technical term for it would be social capital, which basically just means being interconnected with your local community, with your family, with friends. And we've definitely seen a decline in that regard in a variety of contexts, from who we work with to who we go to church with, et cetera. And I think that traditionally, civil society has provided a lot of the social safety net that now we are looking to government to provide. And if we can turn to civil society and attempt to renew those traditional institutions of social security, for example, strong intergenerational ties make a huge difference when it comes to things like elder care, or when someone gets sick, or in Alfie's case, when there's a young person who's in need of care, that one's own family, friends, local community turn to one another to provide support, whether that be as simple as meals or whether that be crowdfunding an online campaign in order to make sure medical expenses are taken care of. And so I think that sometimes we underestimate what civil society is capable of,
Amen.
What our relationships are capable of.
I was talking to my young daughter about this, and I said, you think about it this way. Relying on the government to manage behavior is like being in the car with somebody who's not paying attention to the road because they're texting and not saying anything about it because there'll be a policeman to come along and make them stop at some point. You wouldn't do that. If you're in the car and somebody's texting while driving, you'd tell them to stop and pay attention to the road. You wouldn't wait for the law enforcement officer to come and tell them to stop for you.
Exactly, and when it comes to, particularly in this the intimacy of the healthcare context, I think to recognize that a system cannot account for an individual person and their circumstances and their relationships. And I think the Alfie Evans case is a great example of why it's important that parents and patients be in the driver's seat of their own care, and that we do not underestimate what civil society is capable of doing in order to provide for those people. Case in point was there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people rallying under the banner of Alfie's Army who were willing to pay for his expenses to Italy, willing to pay for his care in Italy. And civil society is capable of doing great things for people. And we cannot be entirely dependent upon the government to provide for every individual circumstance. We need to restore some of our faith in civil society.
And certainly not one to capitalize, but with Mother's Day weekend approaching, I think it's an important conversation we need to be having about roles of family and the importance of parents and the roles in that civil society and the importance of that. And I don't want to be ghoulish and try to make this a Mother's Day story to force the issue, but if it brings it up and it makes it a topic, I think that is to its end a good thing.
I would agree. I think that this is an excellent opportunity, as always, to revisit the importance of family, not just for good policy, but simply in our own lives. And I think that's the beauty of Mother's Day, that we're able to all come together and agree that family has intimate importance to each and every one of us.
Monica Burke, thank you for joining us from the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. I appreciate it. You have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful Mother's Day weekend coming up as well. And thank you for taking some time out with us this week.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you all for tuning in as well. And remember, go to tertiumquids.org and find out more about the program, archives, that kind of thing, and visit us online there. Until next week, so long and thanks for all the fish.